Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Dimitris Helikias. I'm one of the third-year Ph.D. students in the government department, and we're the ones organizing this wonderful conference. We are absolutely delighted to have all of these graduate student presenters here for what has already been a wonderful conference. And we are also delighted to have Professor Teresa Bejan here to deliver the keynote lecture of this conference. So Teresa Bejan is an associate professor of political theory at Oxford. Before coming to Oxford, she's taught at the University of Toronto and Columbia University. She did her Ph.D. in political philosophy at Yale University, Bula Bula. And her first book, Mere Civility, has been widely reviewed in both academic and popular presses and is really a marvelous contribution to contemporary political philosophy and the history of political thought. She'll be speaking today on what was the point of equality. And so without further ado, Professor Teresa Bejan, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dimitri, and thanks also to Sarah for inviting me to give the keynote at this conference. Thanks to Vicky, as ever, for her incredible organizational support. And I just mentioned in the wonderful first panel for the conference that being invited to give the keynote is an especial honor for me because the Harvard Graduate Conference in Political Theory was one of the very first conferences that I presented at as a graduate student. And I won't tell you, it's the 13th now? Annual one. I won't tell you which one I presented at, but it's really wonderful to see the institution flourishing, and it looks like the grad student organizers have done an excellent job. What was the point of equality? As the defining commitment of modern moral and political philosophy, equality has long commanded more allegiance than investigation. Ronald Dworkin liked to describe it in the language of Euclidean geometry as axiomatic. In the moral mathematics of modernity, the basic equality of human beings functions as the underlying major premise from which our entitlement to equal concern and respect necessarily follows. Lately, however, equality has come under renewed scrutiny as both a premise and as a conclusion of political argument. So theorists like dignity like Jeremy Waldron have focused on the nature of the egalitarian premise, that is sort of what it means to describe human beings as equal in the first place, while other theorists are exploring what it really means to treat one another as equals, whether in our political, social, or economic relations. And so much of the latter work especially has been inspired by Elizabeth Anderson and her seminal 1999 essay, What is the Point of Equality? So I guess I should just check. I mean, how many here have read this wonderful essay? Fantastic, right? That's what it is to be seminal. So in that essay, she argues that egalitarian political theory had become fatally unmoored from egalitarian practice as the cry of the oppressed against hierarchical domination and subjection. And in recent work, Anderson has continued this theme, but with her own historical point of reference, namely the so-called levelers during the English Civil War, whom she presents as a continuing source of insight into, quote, problems with current ways of thinking about ideals of equality and freedom, unquote. Anderson is hardly the first political philosopher to turn to the 17th century for inspiration, or to the levelers in particular. Even the most analytic philosopher has been known on occasion to try to lend historical texture to an argument by quoting Colonel Thomas Rainborough at Putney. Surely, I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. And it's just a fun activity. You can go spotting Rainborough across analytic political philosophy. Yet Anderson, in 2017, argues that leveler theory in practice is particularly expressive of relational egalitarian insight. Unlike the philosopher's play with plover's eggs, radicals like Rainborough or the leveler leader John Lilburn had skin in the game and a first-person practical grasp of what Anderson still sees as the point of equality, namely the, quote, dismantling or taming of social hierarchy, right? And also the redress of its status as well as its material harms. Here, Anderson points to Lilburn's articulation of the egalitarian premise in his famous postscript containing a general proposition from 1646, and that's the first quote for you on the handout. God, the absolute sovereign Lord and King, gave man, his mere creature, the sovereignty under himself over all the rest of his creatures, and every particular man and individual man and woman that ever breathed into the world since, who are and were by nature all equal and alike in power, dignity, authority, and majesty, none having by nature any authority, dominion, or magisterial power one over or above another. So Anderson depicts the levelers, like Lilburn, as relational egalitarians rather than possessive individualists, which was the famous charge lodged by C.B. Macpherson in 1962. Yet, what I want to argue in my lecture is that Anderson herself shows a startling disinterest in the point of equality for her early egalitarians themselves, whenever their conclusions deviate from modern egalitarian expectations. Take, for example, and I think this is the famous example, the political exclusion of women in leveler practice. So because Lilburn's postscript includes women explicitly, Anderson argues, quote, the feminist implication of his view is clear, unquote, even if neither he nor his followers drew it themselves. Again, Anderson's not the first. She's not alone in dismissing the hierarchically ordered exclusions that have dogged egalitarian efforts from democratic Athens to the French Revolution as historical baggage or blind spots, right? That is to say that they're philosophically uninteresting, right? We can just get on with the philosophically interesting work of drawing the right conclusions for them. But in the broader project of which this lecture is part, I'm arguing that that kind of dismissal of these hierarchically ordered exclusions as philosophically uninteresting is itself part and parcel of a systematic failure on the part of historians of philosophy and of political thought to historicize the concept of equality itself. And I want to argue that historicizing equality is not only important, as for those Cambridge School contextualists here, it's not only important for us to interpret what Lilburn himself is arguing in that postscript, it's also really important to understand why we look to the levelers in the first place. Because by the time that they were active in the latter part of the 1640s, the natural equality of human beings had been a commonplace for over a millennium, right? And yet it had been seen to have no social or political consequences, or few social or political consequences to speak of. So it seems to me that you have to understand that in order to get to what I would argue, what the interesting question is, which is not sort of when the premise of natural equality emerged or developed in the 17th century, but why, in leveler hands, did what had been a long-standing piety, one seen as consistent with social hierarchy in all sorts of different ways for many centuries, why did that premise suddenly become effectual in ways that it had not been before? And so, inspired by Anderson, and I think this is only fitting 20 years on, in this lecture I want to explore not only what equality meant for the levelers, but what the point as they saw it was. So I'll begin by briefly examining who the levelers were. So for those of you who have no idea, don't worry. I'm about to tell you, and why their theory and practice has so long appealed to modern egalitarians. Next, I'll turn to the myriad meanings of equality before egalitarianism, including identity, balance, and parity, with and against which leveler ideas developed. So although I'm going to say a lot about parity and what's to come, and this concept has largely disappeared from contemporary debates, but I want to argue that recovering parity as crucial to the point of equality for early egalitarians, has not only has important historical, but also it has conceptual and analytic implications for those of us who want to relate as equals today. And if I'm right about this, it seems to me that modern students of equality will find two contrasting, if not contradictory, principles where the self-evident axiom of political geometry should be. So who were the levelers? During the English Civil War, or wars, to get really pedantic, the so-called levelers were a ragtag group of radical civilians living in London, with close associates in the New Model Army. Led loosely by Lilburn, Richard Overton, and William Walwyn, three men of the middling sort who had connections to the radical congregations in London, their organized activities began in 1645. These included relentless pamphlet and petition campaigns against a series of targets. First, the Presbyterians in Parliament, then the House of Lords, then both Houses of Parliament, and finally the Republican Council of State that was finally established after Charles I's execution. As Rachel Foxley has explained, the Levelers were a populist movement rather than a party. And it's a movement that really coalesces around the pre-existing celebrity of John Lilburn. Lilburn had been condemned by Star Chamber in 1638 for unlicensed printing. So this was during the pre-revolutionary period of Charles' personal rule, where he tried to rule without parliament, or he did rule without parliament for 10 years. No contemporary resonances there. So Lilburn had been convicted for unlicensed printing, and so-called freeborn John, as he came to be called, was whipped from Fleet Prison to New Palace Yard. After fighting bravely as an officer in the Parliamentary Army, Lilburn would later resign and continue to develop his unparalleled flair for controversial martyrdom against his former allies. Between 1645 and his death in 1657, Lilburn would be imprisoned repeatedly by Parliament, put on trial for high treason twice, and twice acquitted by a jury of his peers. Good odds. So much of the Levelers' voluminous output was thus directed at whomever happened to have imprisoned Lilburn or his colleagues at the moment. Their consistent campaign for the fundamental liberties of freeborn Englishmen soon became influential in the New Model Army, too, and it inspired the remarkable document known as An Agreement of the People from 1647, which pled for the supremacy of the House of Commons as the people's representative, for frequent elections and a reformed and expanded franchise, and also equal law as the English people's native rights. The transcripts of the Putney debates, it's really a remarkable document. It was only discovered in 1890 in the archive of Worcester College, Oxford. But what you get in the Putney debate in the transcript is this wonderful example of early modern political theory as grassroots practice on a rare occasion when the common people were actually given a voice, and that voice has been recorded. So at the Putney debates, these so-called army agitators and their supporters, like Rainborough, debated the agreement of the people with the so-called grandees, so the army officers like Ireton and Cromwell himself. So Anderson's recent return to the Levelers as egalitarians avant la lettre is thus in keeping with a venerable tradition on the British left, and the British left particularly, but also you get versions of this on the American left and also among American libertarians, that traces the roots of modern democracy, be it liberal or social, back to the Leveler movement in the 1640s. Anderson herself is particularly inspired by Marxist historians of the English Revolution, so people like Christopher Hill. But whereas Hill had sort of degraded, what's the opposite of promoted? Depromoted. Yeah. Depromoted the Levelers as being insufficiently egalitarian because they didn't argue for economic equality, right? Anderson argues that, in fact, Leveler arguments in favor of property rights were authentically egalitarian demands for relational equality in the moment. And so her big argument in her recent book in 2017 is that in the 17th century, at least, the market was left. Similar assumptions, I think, about the Levelers as consistent and authentic egalitarians have long governed the popular and scholarly interpretation of their demands for equal law and equal representation at Putney. And since the rediscovery of the Putney transcripts, these have been read as democratic demands for equal political rights and universal manhood suffrage. Accordingly, the grandees at Putney, so Ireton and Cromwell, are often portrayed as rejecting equality at Putney in favor of a propertied franchise. But what strikes the modern reader is that all sides at Putney agreed that a, quote, more equal representation was necessary. Both sides agreed that they wanted to expand the franchise, right? And also that it needed to become more equal. They simply disagreed on what exactly the principle of reapportionment of parliamentary seats should be. Should it be to, quote, all persons equally? Equally amongst those that have the interest of England in them, namely the propertied? Or equally distributed amongst the same persons that are the electors now? So while the grandees proposed the equality of interest, namely propertied interest, the agitators preferred population. In the end, both sides agreed that servants and other dependents should be excluded from the franchise over Rainborough's objections. That all sides could lay claim to equality at Putney confirms that the concept was maybe just a little bit more complicated than its veneer of self-evidence or mathematical certainty suggests. So to understand the point of equality for the levelers, then it seems we must first attend more closely to the myriad meanings of equality in the 17th century. So this brings me to the second section on the handout. At its most basic level, equality describes a relationship of identity or correspondence between two or more objects. So in the metaphysics, Aristotle distinguishes the equal, to ison, as a relation of oneness with respect to quantity from the identical and the similar. So the opposite of equality is therefore difference. Thus, when Aristotle reports the common opinion that, quote, justice is a kind of equality in the Politics, the sense evoked there is of the equal as the even or level. And the operative image there is of a set of scales, evenly balanced between two weights. So one might think that objects of the same or indifferent weight should be of equal value. But of course, this is a mistake. And this is what allows Aristotle to make his killer observation that, yes, justice is a kind of equality, but in two distinct senses, geometric and arithmetic. And equal or quantitatively identical shares, isomoira in Greek, should be given only to those who are of equal worth or value. Hence, unequal shares should be given to those who are unequal. In classical Latin, one finds a similar set of distinctions, giving rise to what Joel Kay has argued is the primary sense of equality in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, namely equality as balance. As such, equalitas, or equality, was central both in ancient medicine and mathematics, but especially in the medieval balancing acts of Islamic algebra and double-entry accounting, which actually developed at the same time. The relationship was expressed symbolically for the first time in 1557 by the familiar sort of parallel lines of indifferent length by the English mathematician Robert Recorde. So already we can see that even in the long history of equality, the technical sense of equality as quantitative identity informs the common sense of equality as being closely connected with equity in the scales of justice. And so in English, as in classical Greek or Latin, equal could be a synonym for just, while the verbs to equalize or to level were plausible synonyms for restoring a just distribution. So we've seen this already in the debate over equal representation at Putney, right? So let's go back to that, in which both sides associate the redistribution of parliamentary seats amongst localities in proportion to some principle of valuation, whether property or population. And so it's this quest for a more equal parliament as a search for balance that reflects an older and long-standing tradition in English political thought about the meaning of equal government. And the idea there was, what's the appropriate balance between the three estates of crown, lords, and commons, right? So equal government is what we want to protect, but some governments are more equal than others. Equality as balance also accounts for the pejorative leveler, bestowed on Lilburn and his colleagues by their opponents. Not only did that name link them with earlier uprisings in which commoners protested enclosures by leveling hedges, it also evoked the folly of equalizing the holdings of those who were not, in fact, equally worthy. A memorable episode in Spenser's Faerie Queen in 1596 features a, quote, mighty giant standing upon a rock, equipped with an huge great pair of balance in his hand. With the help of his scales, the giant promises to restore balance to the world, quote, and all things reduce unto equality. So for one royalist observer, the contemporary resonances were too hard to resist. Spenser's verses were reprinted in an anonymous pamphlet entitled The Fairy Leveller in 1648, and the correspondence was confirmed by the unlikely anagram, Oliver Cromwell, come our vile leveller. Argument by anagram is, I think, sadly absent from contemporary political theory. So much for equal government. What about people? Well, the well-known claim that humans were aequales under natural law had long been attributed to the first century jurist Sabinus. Yet the preceding discussion suggests that this classical idea of the natural equality was less a matter of shared dignity than it was an observation of indifference. So insofar as they were equally human, all human beings were equal, that is the same or indifferent, under natural but not civil law. And this is Sabinus's point in the Digest. So accordingly, natural equality had little in the way of this worldly consequences, except as a counsel to humility on the part of the great, so kings and priests generally, inclined to the sin of pride. Aquinas argued that their natural equality was fully consistent with the natural subordination of some human beings to other human beings. Still, in the hands of some 16th century Catholic natural lawyers, this indifference principle, if you will, began to have political consequences. So thinkers like Robert Bellarmine or Francisco Suarez pointed out that their natural indifference meant that there was no criterion on the basis of which a God of equal justice could have elevated any one man as master of the rest. Because, quote, and this is on your handout, in the absence of positive law, there is no good reason why, in a multitude of equals, one rather than another should dominate. Therefore, power belongs to the collective body of the people. And then the argument goes, they then confer it on their chosen sovereign. So it's not hard to see why arguments like Bellarmine's drove Sir Robert Filmer mad. By the time Filmer began writing Patriarcha in 1631, he could complain that, quote, the supposed natural equality of mankind has achieved the status of a truth unquestionable. Hence, equity requires that an ear be reserved a little for the negative. Still, the association of equality with balance and indifference explains why, even in the 16th and 17th centuries, natural equality still had so few social or political consequences outside of the law. And once the civil authority had been established, the argument ran, well, then the powers that happened to be should aspire to enact aequalitas as a principle of impartiality in the administration of justice under natural and also civil law. And in this sense, they would be emulating God's own equal judgment. So one of the most important New Testament proof texts for this in the history of equality is, of course, Acts 10:34, in which God is declared to be e prosopolemptes, or in the English translation, so in the 1560 Geneva Bible, we get this translated as God is no acceptor of persons. Despite individuals' many differences of external person, that is, their age, sex, race, wealth, social status, or condition, in God's eyes, they were all, strictly speaking, indifferent. The idea that human beings, unlike God, are distracted by superficial differences and prone to partiality is then why justice must be blind. Still, it remains the case that, as in Aquinas, the point of divine indifference remained that individuals were not equally worthy. The point is brought out really nicely, I think, in Gregory the Great's commentary on the book of Job, and that's also on your handout, in which Job demonstrates his humility by submitting to God's judgment on an equal footing with his servants. If you look at that quote, this is often sort of cited as one of these high points in the history of human dignity. If you just look at what Gregory is arguing, the point is that God, he to whom all are equally subject, will in turn apply his equal judgment to sort the wheat from the chaff, i.e., to make just distinctions between them on the basis of their differential value. So this deflationary reading, and it is consciously deflationary, of natural equality as indifference as the basis for making just distinctions between persons is clearly at odds with the many histories of equality that trace its progress from Genesis to Immanuel Kant. For commentators like Jeremy Waldron, the doctrine of man's creation in God's image, or imago Dei, expresses the idea of basic equality as every individual's positive entitlement to equal dignity and respect. Yet I want to argue that this reading of Genesis actually is not only in considerable tension with how Genesis was read in the medieval and early modern periods, but it's also in tension with the only explicit reference to man's creation in God's image in the New Testament. So Matthew 22:19-21. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So here, the image of God in man is likened to the sovereign imprint on a coin. And just like coins, although we may all bear the same stamp, we are not of equal value. This explains, again, why commentators like Augustine and Aquinas so often explicated creation imago Dei in terms of the images of minting and coinage. For them, it illustrates why, although human beings are naturally aequales, they are also naturally disparata, that is evaluatively distinct. The concept of paritas, or parity, as a relation not of quantity or quality, but of value, has, again, its origins in classical Latin. From the Latin par, it seems that it originated in accounting as a term used to describe two things that were sufficiently similar so as to be commensurable or matching. So here we can think of a pair of shoes, right? They're not identical, they're different, and yet they're similar enough to be matching. Despite their differences, these objects might nonetheless be treated as on a par. Applied to people, of course, parity describes a shared rank or status between those who are both sufficiently aequalis, that is, indifferent, and similis, that is, qualitatively similar, to be roughly evaluatively comparable. Over time, however, the specificity of parity as a value relation has been lost. And so modern English translations routinely render the Latin pares as equals, right? As in the familiar phrase used to describe the Roman emperor as primus inter pares, which in English is always translated as first among equals. Right? But of course, the point of parity, as opposed to equality, was that shared distinctions of social worth are nonetheless consistent with vast in-rank differences of dignity, power, and privilege, as indeed existed between the emperor and his senatorial pares, or peers. It should also be clear by now why the language of parity has fallen out of favor today. Like the distinctions or ordines of the Roman citizenry, in early modern England, parity was closely associated with the division of society into two chief classes: peers, from the Latin pares, via French, and commoners. As the jurist Sir Edward Coke explained in the second book of his Institutes, which was first published in 1642, although it had been written earlier, quote, "Every of the nobles is a peer to each other, though they have several names of dignity, as dukes, earls, and barons. So each commoner is a peer or equal to another, though be of several degrees, as knights, esquires, citizens, gentlemen, yeomen, and burgesses." So peer or equal could thus be synonyms in early modern English, yet where both terms were in use, and I think this is a really crucial point, where both terms are in use, peers conveys a definite sense of high status or rank, and equals conveys a definite sense of low status or rank. So the modern tendency to understand equality and respect as democratic values has masked the fact that for early modern, as for ancient authors, they were primarily an aristocratic concern. And as Keith Wrightson explains, the language of degree, which of course you heard in Cook, that develops, it really comes to the fore in early modern English on the part of aristocrats who want to lend more specificity to these complex relations of deference and precedence across ranks. So I think we can now understand why exactly Robert Filmer in 1631 was so frustrated. Indeed, much like Elizabeth Anderson in 1999, Filmer is just pointing out the disconnect between political theory and political practice. But of course, political practice for Filmer was hierarchical all the way down, and this seemed to him in just outright tension with the premise of natural equality. And also, given this, I think we're now in a position to go back to the levelers and try to figure out exactly what was going on and what the point of equality was for them. So, while Anderson and others have tended to focus on the levelers' political and economic demands, or lack thereof, I want to begin with what I think was actually the primary site of the levelers' egalitarian reforms, namely the law. So in addition to a more equal representative, the other headline demand in an agreement of the people was, quote, equal law. So that, quote, in all laws made or to be made, every person may be alike, and that no tenure, estate, charter, degree, birth, or place do confer any exemption from the ordinary course of legal proceedings whereunto others are subjected. So in that, right, rather than a demand for equal legal rights, as it's sometimes read, what we're finding there is a traditional appeal to equality as indifference, namely, the laws should apply and be administered to all persons equally, irrespective of their social position. And to make that point, Lilburn and Overton do draw directly on the language of Acts 10:34, but of course they're drawing on it in its King James Version, which is not God is no acceptor of persons, but God is no respecter of persons. And in other work, I argue that that translation choice in 1611 actually ends up doing a lot of egalitarian work. In any case, Overton makes the case for equal law to Parliament directly. Quote, "Be no respecter of persons. Let not the greatest peers in the land be more respected with you than so many old bellows menders, broom men, cobblers, tinkers, or chimney sweepers, who are all equally free-born with the hugest men and loftiest Anakim in the land." Of course, the Anakim are a race of Old Testament giants, right? So it's this comparison between the giant men and the lowly bellows mender. So while some contemporaries did take the language of Acts 10:34 in a more radically redistributive direction, Lilburn and his associates continued to insist that equality's natural habitat was the law and the administration of justice. So accordingly, the point of equality for them was to remind Parliament of man's natural indifference. Its force was primarily negative, as a demand for the removal of privilege and invidious distinctions that had rendered justice in England, on their view, so very unequal. Of course, the view that privilege, literally private law, was a violation of equality as indifference could have important political consequences, right? So it informs then this leveler push to abolish the House of Lords, right? And also it informs their attack on the Church of England and the privileges it enjoys as an established church of levying tithes, right? So in Anderson's Private Government in 2017, she wants to argue that the leveler's anti-monopolism is a product of a demand for relational equality. But I think actually that's a misreading. It's part of this push for equality as indifference, as the removal of privileges, not just to lords or the church, but also to guilds or corporations. So I think just generally, one has to be really careful not to impute to the levelers an opposition to social or economic hierarchy, even in principle, on the basis of their anti-monopolistic demands for equal law. So neither Lilburn nor Rainborough is suggesting that there would or should cease to be poor he's in England, right? What they do deny, however, is that such differential wealth or social condition could or should give rise to any plausible legal distinctions. Whether one was the greatest peer or the lowliest tinker, he should remain, strictly speaking, indifferent in the eyes of the law. Okay. So Anderson is really right, though, to draw our attention to leveler formulations of the traditional premise of natural equality as distinctives. So it's what I call the egalitarian premise. And again, let's return to Lilburn's postscript at the very beginning of the handout. So this is a far cry from the notion that those who are equally human are nonetheless naturally disparata. Although there's been a long tendency among scholars to assimilate the levelers to the natural law tradition on the basis of such statements, Lilburn's formulation of the egalitarian premise actually differs markedly from those of other 16th and 17th century natural lawyers, for whom the result of man's natural freedom and equality had been a pronounced power vacuum or void. So as Richard Tuck, who's not here, but who I ran into on the street and assured him that everything I was going to say about natural rights theories was correct, and he's not here to tell me anything other than that. So as Richard Tuck points out, it's that power vacuum that leads to collective theories of natural right. So right doesn't reside in individuals in the state of nature. It resides in the collective, and so can only become active or exercised when it's been transferred to a representative. So as parliamentarians are adapting natural law theory in the 1640s, people like Henry Parker, who's also on your handout, that's the theory that they're adopting. So Parker argued that Parliament was the sovereign representative, not the king. And so the king remains, as he says, singulus major, and yet universis minor. So the idea is that the king is superior to each member of the people individually, and yet inferior to the collective body present in Parliament assembled. And for Parker, too, and this is something that hasn't been noticed, but I think is really important, equal human beings nonetheless remained naturally disparata. In Jus Populi in 1644, Parker compares the differential creation of kings and subjects to that of men and women. Just as women are created from men, yet the marriage contract makes husbands to serve and protect women, makes servants of their natural superiors, so too the social contract can create a kind of, quote, parity in the disparity between a king and the body of the people. So contrast that with Lilburn's language in describing the natural gifts belonging to individuals of both sexes, not only power and authority, but dignity, even majesty, in equal measure, right? So, people point to the very positive picture of man's natural condition in the Levelers, but I think we can be a lot more precise. And what's more striking here is Lilburn is reimagining man's natural state as not simply one of equality, but one of natural parity. And that's evidenced, I'd argue, by the consistent stress that not only Lilburn, but also Overton and others place on the fact that men and women, for Lilburn, are not created not only equal, but always equal and alike. That is, qualitatively similar, right? And that language runs throughout their arguments. And so they are to account for something and not nothing under natural law. So Anderson is right that Lilburn's formulation of the egalitarian premise has relational implications. Only for Lilburn, as for Overton, the point of our creation in God's image and likeness was parity, not equality as such. And one can see the premise of natural parity in action, above all in Leveler practice. So the Levelers were incredible organizers. They organized these petition campaigns, protests, riots, in which men and women participate. And you do get this sense that those who had previously been voiceless within the English Constitution are now able to have a voice, right? And that connection between parity and having a voice that counts, I think, is really crucial. And again, we're back to that idea of accounting. Still, it isn't clear to me how central the parity premise actually was to Leveler's specific legal and political demands. So I think it makes sense that political philosophers are always going to look to the grand abstract statements of first principles in order to discover the point of equality for someone. But this philosophical bias, which has long structured Leveler's reception, risks occluding, once again, what's distinctive about their thought. And again, I'm interested in what's distinctive. So for example, while Lilburn's postscript has been widely reprinted and anthologized, the pamphlet to which it was attached as an afterthought has been almost entirely forgotten. So the Freeman's Freedom Vindicated of 1646 was one of countless pamphlets devoted to Lilburn's amateur exegeses of Coke's commentary on Magna Carta and the common law, as they applied to his own legal case. Traditionally, to be a free man in English meant to be a member of a guild or corporation, such as the City of London, or else one who was not in a state of bonded labor or villanage. And so in the latter sense, as being free from villanage or slavery, is the sense of liber homo in Magna Carta. And so it's just the case that every man in England on that definition is free at the time that Lilburn is writing. So everyone's technically freeborn in this sense. Coke is also the one who popularizes the idea that the law is every English person's birthright. Yet in Lilburn's hands, and you just have to imagine him in prison, a total autodidact, learning law by reading Coke's Institutes, right? In Lilburn's hands, the free man's birthright to due process of law is transformed into an ever-expanding list of specifically enumerated legal rights. This included, above all, the right of every English man to trial by jury, or more accurately, to trial by jury of his peers. This was Lilburn's point in the Freeman's Freedom Vindicated, as well as in Overton's Arrow Against All Tyrants, and countless other pamphlets, namely that Lilburn's current persecutor, the House of Lords, lacked standing to try him, a commoner, for the very simple reason that the peers were not his peers. So the anonymous pamphlet Vox Plebis, which again I've reproduced part of on the handout, appeals directly to Coke's commentary to argue that as the freeman's birthright, the rights enumerated in Magna Carta belong to the whole English nation. For this word, liber homo, or free man, extends to all manner of English people, that is, every man born in the realm. And crucially, the shared inheritance includes the privilege of a trial per legale judicium parium suorum, that is, by his peers or equals. They gloss it. For as the authors insist, the Latin word peers universally signifies both. Thus, while Coke's own language continues to reflect a principled distinction between high-status peers and low-status equals, what you find in Leveler pamphlets is the adoption of the language of birthright to deliberately and systematically conflate the traditional distinction. Whether they were the loftiest Anakims in the land or the lowliest bellows menders, Lilburn and Overton argued that their equal birth entitled all English men to equal respect too, a demand that extended beyond legal rights to other non-legal privileges that the peers enjoyed in the courtroom, including not swearing oaths, or my favorite, being able to keep on their hats. And I'm not talking about the Quakers today, but if you want to know anything about hat honor, please do ask in the Q&A. Anyway, but the point I really wanted to show here is that what they're doing is they're saying that, you know, Englishmen are not only naturally equal or even naturally pares, they're also entitled to enjoy the benefits of peerage, not simply low status equality. So now Anderson and historians like Foxley argue that the thrust of Lilburn's talk of freeborn Englishmen was implicitly inclusive, so even universalist in intent. So on this view, the peerage of freeborn Englishmen simply reduces to the natural parity of mankind, amounting to a universal and inclusive form of leveling up. And this is an argument familiar again from Jeremy Waldron in his work on dignity, rank, rights. What we're doing is we're elevating everyone to the status of aristocrats. Yet this reading neglects something I think that's really important, which is that the concept of birthright is necessarily partial and exclusionary, as an entitlement conferred not by nature, but by birth, in its particular order, time, and place. It's a language that's adapted from the New Testament, so the Old Testament, in the story of Esau, and who sells his birthright to his younger brother Jacob for a mess of pottage. And the story thus features the Hebrew God at his most partial, flouting the natural principle of selection, namely primogeniture, through an arbitrary election. So the leveler language of birthright likewise evokes deliberately a sense of England and the English nation as a chosen nation, enjoying their peculiar national as well as natural rights. Therefore, quote, even the meanest man in England, insisted Lilburn, is as much entitled and entailed as the greatest subject. And again, that language of entitlement and entailment, right? This is the language of primogeniture and entailed properties. So the presumptively high status of the freeborn Englishman is grounded in his salient similarities to those who enjoyed the rights of primogeniture under the current system. The happy conditions of his birth made the free English man, in effect, the elder brother of mankind. So alongside the leveler principle of natural parity, which elevates the whole of humankind from aequales to pares, we thus find an even more radical principle of aristocratic autochthony, which creates a new class of peers. So Pache Anderson, the point of leveling for the levelers was not simply to reduce existing peers to the level of equals, it's also to claim the distinction of peerage and its attendant privileges, including the franchise, for themselves. So in the process, levelers like Lilburn are collapsing the traditional English distinction between high status peers and low status equals, while subtly redrawing the distinction in a new place. As ever in the English class system, some are more equal than others. None of this is lost on their contemporary critics, who see immediately that this is what the levelers are doing, that there's something more than equality implied in their language of equal and alike dignity, majesty, etc. For parliamentarians like Cromwell and Ireton, they see, and also Henry Parker, they see natural parity as a kind of category mistake. So men and women of all social ranks might well be equal by virtue of their shared humanity, yet that did not make them similar or alike enough in worth or quality to be acknowledged as pares, whether as equals or peers. Such an indiscriminate understanding of natural equality was effectively a synonym for democracy or anarchy, and we get this great quote from Thomas Edwards in Gangrena, that quote, makes all alike, confounding all ranks and orders, reducing all to atoms, time, and condition, and devolving all power upon the state universal and a promiscuous multitude. So while parliamentarians are fearing the sort of world turned upside down, right, they're using this language, other critics are actually more attuned to the issue of exclusion. So various leveler and army proposals are explicit in excluding servants or alms takers or royalists. But at Putney, Ireton and Cromwell focus on the matter of strangers, that is, of foreigners, resident in England. They note that the Lilburnian proposal of all the he's, or native freeborn men of England, is in obvious tension with the principle put forward by Rainborough, quote, that every man has a voice by right of nature. Every person may have a voice by right of nature, but not even the levelers are believing that every voice must count. Ireton is really quick to exploit the contradiction at Putney. But of course, the most notorious exclusion, and the one I headlined at the beginning, is that of women. So in the 20th century, it took Carol Pateman's Sexual Contract to remind us of the conspicuous absence of half of mankind from early modern natural law arguments. But this is something that royalist critics are pointing out from the very beginning. So not just Filmer, but Dudley Diggs, John Spellman. So the exclusion of women is galling royalist critics. But it's all the more galling in the Levelers because Lilburn is explicit in the inclusion of women in the natural parity premise. Whereas someone like Overton is much more consistently masculinist in his language. Lilburn explicitly includes women. So what the heck is going on? So few historians will go as far as Anderson as to say that the feminist implication of the view is clear. Nonetheless, many historians are tempted to sort of describe Leveler demands as only parenthetically male, right? You actually get this when you're reading scholarship on the Levelers. They'll say equal, parentheses, male representation, right? So again, we're back to that idea that there's something philosophically uninteresting here about the exclusion. We can sort of pass over it because it doesn't tell us anything really serious about the view. I don't have time to explore the full place of women in the Leveler movement. I certainly don't want to deny that the natural parity claim does have implications for the voice of women in politics. You do get women petitions in the Leveler movement. But what I do want to challenge is the assumption that's present in Anderson, but also just present in so much commentary on early modern egalitarianism, that the premise of natural parity must be or should have been inconsistent with treating sex as a, if not the, natural difference relevant to social arrangements. So again, if you return to Lilburn's postscript, to say that when men and women are created equal and alike in dignity, authority, and majesty is to claim for them a shared distinction in the order of creation, right? We think about the great chain of being. As such, they should be treated equally and as equals under natural law. But to say that men and women are on a par is not to say that they are exactly equal, because parity, unlike equality, permits of differences of degree. So when it comes to the privileges and positive rights of freeborn Englishmen, Levelers could argue that women were insufficiently alike in the most obvious respect. They might be free, they might be English, but they're not men. So what happens is you get a system wherein women remain relatively low status equals, while freeborn English men are elevated to the status of peers. This is still an improvement, though, over the previous dispensation, because you're no longer getting these arguments that women are naturally disparata. Now they're just different. And vive la différence. Anyway, here's the uncomfortable fact that I'm going to lead to the conclusion. Arguably, it's the Levelers' continued exclusion of women and strangers that save them from the most obvious paradoxes of their program. So take the claim to universal privilege that you get in Leveler arguments, right? Or Overton's imputation of a universal distinction among freeborn Englishmen. Overton wants to make every individual person a sovereign lord, king, priest, and prophet in his own natural circuit and compass. So while the idea of human beings being equally free had long been standard in natural law arguments, the translation of equal freedom into equal lordship is a much more controversial move, because lordship implies superiority, and Suarez had argued that it is not and cannot be true that every individual man is superior to the rest. It's just logically impossible. And so I think the people who are most sensitive to this paradox in the 17th century are the people who are most sympathetic to the Leveler program. So people like Marchmont Needham, but also, above all, Thomas Hobbes. So in Leviathan, when Thomas Hobbes describes the natural condition of mankind, it reads as a satire on Lilburn and Overton's original position. In this state of nature, individuals are as little lordlings, right, engaged in a suicidal status competition to vindicate their natural superiority. Better on the whole, says Hobbes, that every man acknowledge other as his equal by nature. So now to conclude. Today, the once ubiquitous language of parity has largely disappeared from our political vocabulary. We prefer to speak of disparities, right, of power, wealth, or representation, with strong connotations of injustice. Perhaps our unwillingness to apply the positive concept parity to people reflects the fact that today, as in the 17th century, the word peer still describes those who are only of rough, but not identical, social value or ability. Parity is thus compatible with, nay, maybe even presupposes, hierarchy in at least two respects. First, it presupposes hierarchies of rank, that is, a relative ordering of statuses, relative to which the status of pares is either high or low, so it has its distinctive social value. And secondly, parity permits of hierarchies of degree, that is, differential dignity within each rank, reflective of an individual's relative ability or worth. Still, understanding parity is crucial for understanding leveler theory in practice, as well as in overcoming our teleological assumptions about the meaning of equality as a presumptively universal and inclusive principle that must necessarily be hostile to hierarchy and exclusion. To return to the question of my title, what was the point of equality? Well, for the levelers at least, there were 2 points, not one. And the 2 points were in some tension. Whereas equality as indifference operated negatively as the denial of difference, equality as parity functioned positively as a claim to distinction. So Anderson is right to read leveler theory in practice as supporting the 1999 insight that the point of equality is not stuff but standing, including quite literally how one stands in relation to others. Only for the levelers, standing is the point of parity, not of equality, which elevates those who were hitherto indifferent to the status of equals, and those particularly blessed among them to the level of peers. And I just would say, the levelers are not the first egalitarians to try to tame a hierarchy by placing themselves on top. It happens again and again. We see this again and again. So on this basis, though, I want to distinguish between 2 kinds of egalitarianism. One, positive, which aims at leveling up by claiming parity of status for the least privileged with the most privileged, and one negative, which insists on leveling down by denying all claims to difference or distinction and reducing the level of all accordingly. So historically, we could associate the former with the levelers and the latter with Hobbes. And I would argue that Hobbes is consistently a leveler, and actually his title, Leviathan, is meant to tell you that. Thus, Waldron and others who present the history of equality as an irresistible process of leveling up are thus telling us only half the story. And I hope that this lecture at least shows that maybe half the story is not enough. Secondly, the recovery of parity suggests that the persistence of hierarchy and exclusion today, as in the 17th century, even in our society of equals, is best understood not as an embarrassing failure to apply the principle of equality equally, but rather it's a legacy of early modern efforts to reconcile what I think is an irreconcilable difference between universal indifference on the one hand and parity of respect on the other. I say irreconcilable because peerage remains implicit and incipient in natural parity whenever the demands, tell them I'm lecturing, whenever the demands of a particular time, place, or purpose call for the creation of a class of peers whose voices count over and above their equals. Right? That's always going to happen when the particular meets the universal in that moment. After all, the leveler, right? So anyway, we can see the levelers doing just that. My concern then is that relational egalitarians like Anderson, who are basically finding their way back to parity without recognizing the tension between this particular partial and exclusionary principle and the universal, impartial, and inclusive principle that they take equality to be. So taking leveler theory and practice seriously, I agree with Anderson that we should do this, even when it deviates from our modern expectations, promises to keep us alert to the ways in which the limits of likeness have and will continue to constrain our efforts to establish a society of equals. So my hope here is that just as historically informed political theory can help us understand what we're doing, it can also help us understand what we're doing wrong. Thank you.
So I want to welcome again Professor Bejan back to the Harvard Grad Conference. We were delighted you could come back in the capacity of Keynote. And thank you for a very engaging talk, which I think has broad appeal across disciplines and also across different interests and methodologies within political theory itself. So thank you for lending us some conceptual clarity. Um, in the interest of time, I won't give a very belabored summary of the remarks you've just heard, but I will restate somewhat the premise. So Professor Bejan asks the question not when the premise of natural equality emerged in the 17th century, but rather why what had been a long-standing piety, consistent with the existence of social hierarchy for over a millennium, suddenly became effectual in unprecedented ways. So in what follows, she looks into both theory and, importantly, praxis in the Leveler project. And here she argues that the Levelers brought together two understandings of human equality. One, equality of indifference, and the second as equality as parity, by which they lay claims to the traditional privileges of English peers as a common birthright of freeborn Englishmen. The first of this, again, was not particularly inventive or new, but the introduction of the second and sometimes collapsing the distinctions between the first and the second has endeared the Levelers to modern study. So I want to, broadly speaking, discuss first the equality of indifference, just to discuss how that that traditional view of equality plays into leveler theory and praxis, and then to some extent the relationship between these two types of equality, and then finally I wanted to briefly comment on the particular position of the levelers and their innovations. So the levelers use equality as indifference as a kind of program of legal status, equal standing for all under the law. But you say this concept is nothing new. Rather, it's a kind of application to civil law of a traditional understanding of what it means to be aequales under the law of nature or under God. This has legal implications in its most natural traditional usage, i.e. that all are subject to the natural law and the judgment of the eternal law. But more generally, equality as indifference simply presupposes an external objective measure in front of which we are indifferent, and which we could consequently use to judge each other. And this is why equality of indifference is friendly to distinctions of hierarchy and rank. It is not that we are all substantially equal, but equal with respect to our being subject to this external measure. The main theoretical support of this position seems to be from Christian sources, who argue that God is indifferent with respect to persons. On this point, it's not totally clear to me that it's straightforwardly the case that there's a univocal or even orthodox tradition that God is indifferent to humans in all respects. So perhaps some sects argue this, but in the sources you quote, Aquinas and Bellarmine, they indicate that God is, at least in many ways, not indifferent with respect to humans. Aquinas says that God very personally grants privileges and talents and capacities, even in the prelapsarian state. So God, as a person or creator, is not indifferent. He might be indifferent with respect to some one function, or two functions, which I'll return to in a second. And Bellarmine, too, allows for distinctions here. So in this very section, you're quoting about God's equal justice not having any basis on which to elevate one man as master of the rest. This very chapter also mentions that God personally appoints the ecclesiastical sovereign. So this is an elevation of juridical rank based on a person of God's own choosing, not out of his partiality. So I wonder if it makes sense to say not that God is totally indifferent to us in a univocal sense, or we stand indifferently in front of God, but rather that we stand indifferent in front of divine law. So this standard which measures us indifferently is again legal. I think this makes equality as indifference into a kind of legal status specifically. Law, not God, is no respecter of persons. And this makes sense to me, but perhaps you have an objection based on your broader view and greater expertise on indifference. I might say here one more caveat. Although I think a narrowing of equality as indifference to a legal relation, to merely a legal relation, works at least better with the Christian thinkers you marshal here. this modification has a defect of necessitating that divine law is also meted out indifferently. And I also have a worry that even this narrow property of God's functions, meting out divine law, simply describes as indifferent, is just not what much of Christian thought has consensus on. So it's typically understood that the fisherman and the merchant and the bishop are not subject to the divine law in the exact same way. The bishop and his peers are judged much more harshly than the fisherman. So you might say there's a kind of a state system in divine law. The laws are both promulgated and judged in different ways for different people. Anyway, so much for narrowing equality as difference to a strictly legal property. I might just say that this kind of narrowing wouldn't affect your analysis of the levelers. They seem to use equality of indifference as purely legal, but perhaps understanding equality as indifference in a legal way as a kind of equality in front of some objective legal measure of acts might have some interesting implications on the study of kind of the development of theories of equality. So I don't know. So secondly, I wanted to ask about the relationship between these two types of equality, as indifference and equality as parity. Just briefly on this point. So you mentioned that equality as indifference operates as a necessary precondition for making just distinctions between persons on the basis of their comparative merit or worth. So it's not opposed to social hierarchy in any way. And you distinguish this view from the kind of imago Dei styled arguments of positive entitlement to equal dignity and respect, so more commonly modern arguments of parity. I wondered what might be the relation between the objective measure for just distinctions offered by equality as indifference and distinctions of rank offered by equality of parity, equality as parity. So distinctions among different groups of people within which are considered pares. So in other words, without an objective standard standing outside of the two people or groups, like natural law or God, what is the principle of proportionality in equality as parity? Can it just be used for any kind of principle of proportionality? Is it specifically socially defined rank? It seems historically it's used as socially defined rank, but is there some kind of inherent quality of proportionality distinguishing between the rank of, the pares up here and the pares down here? I wanted to ask as a final point on the kind of role of the levelers in this history of equality, specifically on this question of the relation between leveler theory and praxis, which you emphasize very much even in the title of your talk, what was the point of equality? So you say that levelers in practice succeeded in holding two somewhat paradoxical views of equality together. They appeal to equality and indifference in their calls for equal standing under the law. They appeal to equality. Equality as parity in their clamoring for extended legal privileges of peers to common Englishmen. In short, equality of indifference appears in their leveling down, in the removal of estate distinctions, and in legal proceedings. And equality of parity appears in their leveling up, or the addition of privileges based on inherent dignity among people who are basically pares. This latter collapsing of equals and peers has endeared levelers to modern egalitarians, in the line of Elizabeth Anderson, who think that the levelers are introducing these kinds of imago Dei arguments that might be some kind of precursor to either Kantian ideas of dignity or egalitarian claims to respect rather than indifference. And certainly the definitions you return to again and again, the Lilburn and Overton definitions, bear this affinity between levelers and modern egalitarians out. There's a reason Anderson quotes this particular postscript. as you say, this definition is smuggling parity into natural equality. And this is very substantively different from past definitions. Not only are men equal merely under conditions of freedom and status before the law, but they are also pares with respect to majesty and dignity. But I actually think this nice innovation at the level of theory, that is the Lilburn and Overton's assertions of common majesty of men and women by virtue of shared humanity, which you return to many times, is a bit of a red herring for what you take to be the real innovation of the levelers. So there's considerable argumentative force to the point you make that parity in the sense of substantial dignity and privilege requires hierarchy and some range of ranks. And I think leveler practice bears this out very nicely, but I'm not sure that the kind of history of theories of equality culminating in Overton and Lilburn's quotes shows this insight very clearly. So the frequent invocation of these quotes, which are somewhat misleadingly universalist or extended, I think detracts from this real innovation here, which is not simply the extension of dignity and majesty to everyone, but everyone within a certain rank. And I think this is important for the kind of talk this is, because Anderson seems to like the levelers, not just because they have a nice definition, but because their radical praxis is so appealing. You know, their boots on the ground radicalism seems to get the point of what egalitarianism is. You know, they're not philosophers fiddling around with the minutia of economic distribution. But the problem that you point out is that the praxis of the levelers doesn't really accord with the praxis of Anderson. But I'm not sure that the theory of the levelers accords with the praxis of the levelers, if that makes sense. And it actually makes one more inclined, I think, to think that there really was a deep contradiction in leveler theory and praxis. Now, maybe there is at the level of theory. I mean, this is a 45-minute talk, so maybe there was at the level of theory redefining of equality and parity, including that kind of innovation. But I think that a focus on that might be good. And I think I'll stop there, and perhaps, should I just directly open the floor to questions?
Why don't you respond briefly, and then we'll take a batch of questions.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really incisive and insightful comments. Yeah, I'll respond briefly. I take the first point about the complexities of indifference and the importance of different kind of Christian. There is no sort of consensus about what this would mean. And especially, I like very much your point about basically an estate theory of law, that there are actually differential responsibilities and functions for different estates under natural law for someone like Aquinas. And so I think that that's wonderful. It is the case, in my earlier work, it's all about bringing religion and ecclesiastical arguments back in. And in this project, I really am just focusing on the natural and the civil law as opposed to divine and ecclesiastical. But you're totally right to call me on that there is an important part of the story that's being left out. I wouldn't want to suggest, however, that the leveler use of equality as indifference is not itself radical. It was, right? Because they're specifically they're arguing for the extension of natural parity from natural law to civil law in this sense that people are low status, aequales, pares, under civil law, and that includes women and everybody else, right? So there is a kind of leveling up there, but it's a leveling up from nothing to low status equality. So there's that. The second question, is there a single qualitative measure for the making of just distinctions under is there a parity principle? One at the time. I mean, no, it's contested, but I think a lot of what's happening in the 1640s is a cashing out of questions that were at stake in kind of this earlier question, the so-called gentry question, sort of what makes a person gentle. So it's this quest for the English middle class, if you will, even though they're commoners, to be able to establish themselves as among the better sort. So gentry status is not having simply to do with birth, but also having to do with education and virtue. And indeed, the whole idea of a university degree, many of which, most of everyone here, I assume, is the recipient of one or several degrees, is precisely that they elevate you. to a higher social status. So that's the idea of a gentleman's degree. You became a gentleman in virtue of having received this. Nathan is a gentleman by virtue of his Oxford degree. Anyway, so I think that that's definitely salient. And again, a part of why the levelers are able to make this conflation between peers and equals is precisely because of the language of degree that has been brought in, the fact that you could talk about equal degree between those who are pares. Right. And so finally, this kind of, so where's the contradiction? Is it the contradiction between theory and practice, or is the contradiction between the levelers' practice and Anderson's theory, or is the contradiction between their own theory and practice? I mean, I think that there's a whole host of contradictions, but what motivates me to give this paper at all, or to write a paper like this, is precisely because I really like Anderson's sense that we have something to learn from practice. What really bothers me then is this sort of philosopher's resort to, okay, well, it's all about the statements of principles, and then if the practice doesn't conform to the principles, or even if the principles are not self-conforming, we don't have to worry about it. I mean, I think we do have to worry about it. I think we always have to worry about it. But I would also just say, I mean, if you look at, again, this is a problem of people whose work I highly respect and admire, not only Anderson, but also Philip Pettit or Jeremy Waldron. So often their engagement with 17th century texts is at some remove. So they're already engaging with texts that have been sort of adapted and anthologized. So just take Lilburn's postscript. It's not clear to me that he's not saying that men and women are created equal and alike within sex, because he distinguishes between Adam's creation and then Eve's creation from Adam. So if you leave that part out, then yes, you get this kind of universalist, potentially feminist sort of reading, but it's not even clear on the basis of the text that that's what's being said. And so, as ever, I'm not going to apologize for being pedantic, but I do think we have something to learn from past practice. But I think that partly, I'm a convinced Andersonian. Part of her objection in 1999 was the fact that in not taking practice seriously, we're showing a kind of contempt for people who have really actually fought on the ground. And so what I'm trying to do is to take leveler practice and theory seriously and to treat them with respect. So thank you.
We have some time for questions, or maybe?
Yeah, so we have till 6:45, so I think maybe we should take questions in batches, and I'll leave it to you to call on 2 or 3 people at a time, and then there's mics that will be running up and down.
Thank you very much. I'm curious, Anderson calls her conception of equality democratic equality. And I was listening for it, and I only heard democratic come up once in the talk. And I don't mean to impress upon you my own interest in this moment of democratic theory, but I am curious what you think that qualification of democratic equality does, and particularly since you're looking back on her work and you're thinking about practice and theory alignment and whether or not it does, and because in her 2017 work, Anderson ultimately gets to a workplace democracy as sort of maybe a moment where we can try to reconcile moments of theory and practice. So, and also because during this time, there's a project of democratization going on in institutions to try and, to some extent, implement some of the things that were going on in sort of general speaking enlightenment kind of project. So I was just wondering if you have thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a question specifically about the what you said at the very end about the philosopher's response on insisting on the superiority of principle of over practice, and how that shows contempt of those who fight in the trenches. So when that paper came out, the Anderson paper in '99, it was not the case that the universal reaction to that was some kind of liberation, right? That people thought, wow, finally somebody is setting us back on course. It was more, I mean, some people thought that, but a lot of people also thought, okay, what is going on here? Because it seems there's a bit of a strawman attack going on, right? Because there had been there had been the debate for quite some time that really started with Amartya Sen's Equality of What project, and then kind of, it did become increasingly baroque in terms of figuring out the subtleties of black egalitarianism. But it wasn't so much that there was an intended or even implied disregard for practice. It was more, there was an interesting set of background questions that like in any other area of academic inquiry, in any other area where people with university degrees work, took on a certain dynamic, and the subtleties were taken seriously, right? So a lot of people thought this is the sort of weird thing within philosophy where some philosophers want to say, hey, we are doing some practice relevant stuff, and but by the way, we are publishing this in Ethics, right, which is the kind of journal read by the political movement. So it seemed like a weird sort of, we are doing something better than you, but we want the right people to read, which is why we publish that in that journal. And so one way of bringing this down to a question is, so what kind of political philosophy, in your judgment, since you are a card-carrying Andersonian, what's the kind of political philosophy that's clearly the wrong sort to do?
We'll take one more in this round.
Thank you so much, Professor. I have a question on virtue, as you raised in response to the the commentary. So, aequalitas. I'm curious to hear if you distinguish it from aequitas. It seems to me that aequalitas is just from aequalis, which is explicitly comparative, and whereas aequitas comes from and sometimes used more as an internal condition, as almost sometimes even synonymous with virtue. Say in Suarez and Vasquez, they would say that it's on account of juristic aequalitas that, say, a strong state enters into a series of complex relations with a weaker state, and sometimes in having a just war, you can counter that by virtue of this aequalitas, but it is to your aequitas to be benevolent and to give some pity. Wondering if there's kind of moral tone to the more juridical sense of equality. And related to that, in terms of virtue of a single person within whose soul there is aequitas, virtues, of course, is it problematically and intrinsically not an anti-egalitarian translation of arites, but when you have excellentia, which always also comes from excelling, and it's inherently, some people are more virtuous than others on account of that. He's more equal than the others, and Solon, in having established equal laws for everyone, he has to depart in order to make it really equal, because he's so superior. Obviously, he's the legislator, and we have Rousseau's mythical legislator, who is obviously above human capacity. So I just have a question on the broader issue: where does virtue fit into this picture of rediscovery of parity?
Can I just ask for clarification? So when you said that aequalitas has a moral sense, was that supposed to be in contrast to a kind of ethical sense of equitas?
Yes, the more generic and more moral sense of the aequitas versus the more juridical sense of the aequalitas, because it's more explicitly comparative.
Okay.
Because sometimes you can say one single virtuous man has the equality of aequitas, but you wouldn't say that he has aequalitas without comparing him explicitly to someone else.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks very much for these. I mean, to take the first question first, what work is democratic doing in democratic equality? I mean, I agree with Nico Kolodny that it's fairly stipulative in the 1999 essay, and then in 2017 she's trying to work it out more, but it's not obvious to me that relational equality has democratic political consequences. And so that's why I take seriously the idea of someone like Hobbes as some kind of relational egalitarian. And I know that's a very controversial view, but that's part of what I'm exploring here, is that the kind of, there's, again, I see this sort of stipulation of, or the insertion of democratic into that argument as, again, just reflective of this sort of teleology where all good things go together. And if we like this kind of social argument, well, then of course it's going to have the political implications that we want. And just for the sake of distinctions, I think that, I'm trying to push back against that. And also I just have a kind of cussedness about me that leads me to do these things. Speaking of cussedness, Anderson strawmanning. I agree. I agree that Anderson strawmans. When I say that I'm a principled Andersonian, I mean in this kind of practice focus and the interest in historical practices. I don't mean that I'm a card-carrying relational egalitarian. I mean, I'm convinced by, by arguments that relational equality has distributive implications, and I would hardly be a person to say, political philosophers are wrong for caring about subtlety. We'd all be out of a job. So that point is really well taken, but so which political philosophy then would I prescribe? I mean, I would say in all of my work, let 1,000 flowers bloom. However, insofar as this kind of historically informed work is being done, and I say bully for that, I do then want to say that there are standards of interpretation here. We don't all have to be Cambridge School contextualists. I am a shameless presentist. Shameless, right? Be presentist. Nevertheless, if you say we can learn from the past, really go there, right? Instead of just saying, oh, this guy says something that vaguely sounds like something I like, therefore he must agree with me. Finally, right, just equality versus equity. There's a much bigger story here. I like very much the sort of contrasts that you were drawing. I mean, all I can say to you right now is that it's complicated, because my sense of what happens is that the kind of equality discourse that spins off in early modern English political philosophy in European discourses ends up being a kind of equity discourse. So I'm thinking of Pufendorf here, right? The idea, well, the question is, okay, well, what's equity demanding? And so why does that happen? Well, I think that there are kind of linguistic issues. I think also the fact that partly what I'm doing, again, to go back to your very good comments, is trying to bring law back in, right? And say, well, if we're thinking about the significance of law, then equity for the levelers is associated with the equity courts, right? So there are different kinds of courts that are doing different kinds of law and making different kinds of judgments. And so working out how egalitarian theory is developing within and against particular institutional sites and practices is not only essential for us historically to get what's going on, but also to think about, well, what does it mean to treat one another as equals? So thank you.
A batch of 2 questions.
Okay, I'll be very brief.
Thanks so much for your talk. I will ask you a question about recognizing each other as peers and how it is possible. I caught that you defined parity as not only being equal and alike, but also being qualitatively similar. Is that right?
Well, to be alike is to be qualitatively similar.
Okay, being qualitatively similar. Okay, that's my keyword there. So I think that recognizing one another as qualitatively similar is kind of epistemically demanding. You kind of need to know the person in order to establish that they are qualitatively similar to you. So I feel like it requires kind of social integration and familiarity with your society and your community to conclude that you are living among peers. So do you agree with this, or do you think that it is possible to recognize each other as peers even in large scales and in big nation states?
One more question.
It was a brilliant and erudite presentation, as always, Professor Bejan. I wanted to ask you about one political theorist, and if this is not in the wheelhouse, feel free to punt. But there is one political theorist that I thought of immediately when you were talking about how parity has fallen out. But Nancy Fraser has kind of made this pretty central to her attempt to rehabilitate critical theory and her particular conception of it as participatory parity. And I was sort of thinking through your distinction, and one of the things that I thought was always interesting about her idea is that it's partly regulative, right? So that it's not just a leveling up and keeping the standards of the peer relation constant. It's supposed to critique it and help us rethematize, rethink it in a wide variety of contexts, right? So it's across activist groups. The participatory parity is supposed to stand in whether you participate in NAACP or whether you participate in government or whether you're in the workplace. And so I was just wondering if you might say a little bit about whether that kind of addendum, the participatory part, helps square the circle of the tension you're describing, and that you brought out really well with your analysis of levelers.
Brilliant, thank you. And well, I think that these questions go very well together. So it's this kind of question about, well, if the determination of likeness is epistemically demanding and we sort of experience that likeness in the context of these sort of small groups and in this mutual participation and a kind of association, is that generalizable? So this is something that I am really interested in terms of what are the contemporary implications of this. I mean, one thing I would just point out is that I think there's one reaction to say, oh, well, we can get away from parity, or we can make it, the point is to make it universal and inclusive and just fight against the likeness impetus. And I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong for reasons that Fraser thinks it's wrong. So my own view would be that what we do is we experience parity of different kinds in different contexts, and that no one, in a way, this is a sort of, I'm hoping somewhat to redeem the sort of Waltzerian complex equality argument, which is to say that no one will be a peer in all areas, but it's the experience of parity as a high status that gives us this kind of security to be free. So yeah, to go to Fraser, I mean, I'm just going to have to say, yes, it's really relevant. I mean, I need to engage with her more. My sense, though, is that it's still tied to this presumption of the possibility of infinite inclusion. And I understand that works for the argument that she wants to make. That's partly what I'm trying to unsettle. So I think you're right. I overstate my claim at the end. So not only Fraser, but also Ruth Chang, who does amazing stuff with parity in the ethics of evaluation. So it's not that no one's talking about this, but on that issue, right, the sort of the presumption that all good things go together. We can have equality and inclusion and parity and all of these things. It's like, well, no. In what ways are our ideals cutting against each other? And precisely, what's been lost by the sort of hegemony of the language of equality, right? Because I think basically we're asking equality to do too much, right? And then we're at risk of turning it into a vacuous ideal. Thank you.
Okay, so please join me in thanking Evelyn Flashner for those comments and Professor Teresa Bejan for a wonderful lecture.